Hello there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is fantastic to see you coming into the webinar today. My name is Mike Bander. I am very pleased to be your host. I'm one of the co-founders here at Waybook.com. And today I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by the fantastic Sarah Touzani here. Sarah is a woman with a huge amount of hats, a huge amount of insights, and you might be able to tell with a Batman style library backdrop behind there, a huge amount of insight to share with us today as well. Hey Sarah, how are you doing?
No pressure at all. Thanks, Mike. I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very well. I'm really excited to have this conversation. And for those of you who are just tuning in now, Sarah and I have actually become friends over the last few months, and we've bonded over our love of startups, scale-ups, operational craziness, and we really got into some fantastic conversations about how we can create, craft, protect, and grow culture as we're scaling our businesses. Now, we're here today to ask the question, as you can see, how to protect and manage culture while scaling your business. Sarah has actually had many roles over the years, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about it. But she's also been the COO of Credit Spring. Credit Spring, in Sarah's time, actually grew from 4 to 60 people within those 4 years. And also she had an incredible time, which we all had, of COVID, where all of our business operations, everything we knew to be true was totally disrupted. And Sarah was really in the heart of how we kind of shape culture, create culture as we're going through different working styles and business pressures. So I've got loads of questions. I'm going to try and keep mine to about 25 minutes so we can go straight to the audience to hear what you want to ask Sarah. But first of all, Sarah, let's just say hello from you. Can you just give us an introduction? I'm sure I butchered your intro there, so over to you.
Yes, I'm Sarah. I have a background in banking and consulting, then at some point just realized that the pace at which things were done within startups fits my personality type better. And I made the jump and moved countries from Paris to London and joined what was back then a 4-people company called Credit Spring. Pre-product, pre-customers, pre-revenue, just 4 of us in a room and trying to figure stuff out. And when I left a couple of months ago, the team was more than 65, like in headcount, 40, 45 people, of which used to report into me from data to marketing at some point, to business operations, customer operations, product. So quite a variety of things. And raised the Series A, like quite a substantial one, more than 50 million pounds. And I moved on to new adventures that I'll probably be able to talk about in a few months, but not for now. In the meantime, I also work with a few startups as an advisor of fractionals and also do a little bit of angel investment. So I'm trying to see the startup world and ecosystem from every position I can be in and keep on learning, basically. And yeah, I'm really passionate about culture and excited to tell you more about my thoughts and experience building one, fixing one, and scaling one.
Amazing. Let's just jump in, because I feel like, Sarah, because you've done so much, we can be on introductions for hours. Basically, what Sarah hasn't said is she's previously worked in corporate as well, and she's worked in risk and fine-tuned those skills, which helped her dive into such a rapid success with Credit Spring and beyond. But let's just jump straight into the topic of the day in terms of culture and how we can scale it. So you joined when there was 4 people. Let's just kick off with the fact of what is culture when we're 4 people in a room, and actually how do we identify and know what our culture is at the early stage in order to protect it through scaling?
Yeah, very good point. So I've seen it at Credit Spring, but also seen it through other companies that I'm advising outside of that. And I would say there's 2 ways to think about culture very early on, and you'll see 2 different approaches depending on who the founders are. There are a type of founder who is going to think about what culture very deeply and will start from the position that this is the culture we want the company to have. They will probably have put some thought into it, put it in writing, challenged it, came back to it. So really very culture focused and culture driven. And then you'll have the other founders who would say, this is BS, this is not my thing. Let's deal with it when we'll get to it. And what you tend to see is that when you actually don't think about it early on, it comes back and bites you, because you leave it. Culture, it's not because you don't take care of it or you don't think about it that it doesn't exist. Culture is basically the way you work, the way you do things, the way you communicate with each other within a company. And whether you put it in writing or you think about it or you have a view on it or not, it exists. So the earliest you start thinking about it and like being intentional with your culture, the better it is, because it means you can drive it rather than just be passive and have to take it on. Yeah.
Just in that, so it's interesting because when my understanding of culture is, even if we're not thinking about culture, we're creating culture. But also a big part of culture is like building that authentic, but also consistent way of being and acting and operating. So two brief questions. Firstly, how far can the culture be in the early stage from the co-founder's way of working and belief set? And secondly, what can go wrong if we're not shaping that?
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely linked to who the founders or co-founders are early on. Why? Just because they are a certain way and they probably like people who are a certain way and share similar values, whether they thought about them as being values or not. And because founders are very much involved in hiring in the early days, they will tend to hire for culture fit. And so they will tend to be involved in in hiring decisions and hire people who fit the culture that they want to set in the company. So it's very much culture, like the culture will derive from the personality of the founders. And you can you can see it, especially early days, you can see when you start working with a company, what the personality type of the founder is, because it's everywhere in the way people work. So yeah, very much founder based. But then at some point, when you start having other people involved in the hiring process, how do you manage to stay consistent in keeping that culture? Because you're going to delegate the decision on hiring, and potentially as a founder, you're not going to be running the interviews anymore. So you need to delegate decision making when it comes to hiring, which means that potentially your culture is going to get diluted because you're not controlling that as much. This is where starting to think about it and maybe sharing it and putting words on it becomes important.
And so within Waybook, we largely work with businesses that are from 10 people up to about 250, 300 people, and they're on all of the different spectrums of managing their culture. But one thing that is really consistent with all of our Waybook users is that they're there to systematize their business. They're looking to create the systems and the processes that make them consistent. And a lot of that translates by them creating knowledge and SOPs, which can be shared across their organization, shared to their teams. And yes, you can delegate the hiring to somebody and you can push that SOPs of how we do customer success or sales or whatever that would be. So if somebody is approaching creating a kind of a business playbook, how much of that already takes care of culture, but actually how much of that do we need to be, or what should we be adding into an SOP or a welcome document to ensure that the culture is injected into that?
Yeah, very good point. I think a tool like Waybook is actually great to cement what culture means, because what we were saying just earlier is that at some point, you need to delegate decision making across the company, whether it is on like a smaller scale, small decisions, or bigger decisions to people who are more senior in the company. At some point, as a founder or as a founding team, you're not going to be making all of the decisions. So how can you make sure that people still make the right decisions at scale when they are empowered to make them? It's by having a consistent culture, because culture and the values you share as a company should be able to guide you and tell you what decision is the right one to make. But then the question, like you said, is how do you know that? How do you know like where culture exists? So I think culture needs to be embedded at every step of the employee journey. So from the hiring process, make sure that your hiring process is filtering for culture fit, or someone who, if doesn't fit into the culture, can enrich the culture if you want to switch it slightly. But also at the onboarding phase, it's really the point where you should cement that culture and make it very clear what the culture of the company is and how things are done here. Hopefully, if you pick the right person with the right culture fit, nothing should come like completely as a shock to them. They should match the culture in some way, but you still need to reinforce it at the onboarding stage. So if you can make it clear how decisions are made, what the values of the company are within the onboarding process on Waybook, for example, it's great because it takes care of embedding your culture and your values in the onboarding. And then the nice part about that is they can also come back to it after onboarding, because what you also see as an excuse is, as a bad way to do things, is that you spend like your first week or so of onboarding is very much values and culture driven, and then you don't talk about values or culture anymore. And so it goes back to the background, and you sometimes even forget about it. Having something like Waybook means that they can go back to one single source of truth and see what the values are and how they can action them on their day-to-day.
Amazing. So I'm getting this right. So culture at the early days largely comes from the co-founding. As we delegate responsibility, we need to make sure that's transferred in the right way. We know that values are a part of that, and employing that into something that people can understand, is centralized and can refer back to, is good. I'm going to go back and fill in, or ask the questions of how we can fill in the blanks. What are the tenets of culture? I feel like we've said culture a lot. And if we were from the side of the camp you mentioned earlier, where the founders that think that culture is BS, I still wouldn't be able to explain to them what culture is from this. So what are the tenets? We've got the values, but what else constitutes culture?
Yeah, again, to go back to values, I think it's super important to make them actionable. So if you say, lots of examples of companies who have stuff as transparency or trust or honesty as values, but this is a bit obvious, right? Like, how can you filter using this? If you do an interview with someone and you need to test them on honesty, like, no one is going to say, oh, I'm a liar, actually, don't trust me. It seems quite obvious. I think culture needs to be way stronger and more divisive than this, meaning it should be stuff like, in our company, for example, we always start a meeting with the bad news. This is culture, right? If I have one bad news, let's say, you can say, yes, there's no meeting where I have a bad news and a good news. I'm going to start with the bad news. This is clear and effective. This is real culture, meaning not everyone does it this way, right? Not everyone is going to agree that this is the right way to do it, but this is how things are done within X company, right? This is the way we want to do things. At Waybook, we prefer calls over endless chats on Slack or whatever tool, right? This is how we solve problems. We get on a phone call, we solve it and move on. In other companies, they might say, we actually put it in writing. We write a doc, we do it async, we comment on each other's ideas. And this actually constitutes culture. It means that when you're facing an issue, you know what side to go. And you know that if you want to get something done, you're either going to pick up the phone and call someone, or you're actually going to send them an email detailed with options and wait for them to come back to you, right? Because this is how things are done. So they need to be more action driven and action oriented rather than just, honesty is great, we're all friends and stuff like that, because no one is going to disagree with that, and you're not going to be able to filter people through based on this, or to establish a strong feeling of we are a team and this is how we function as a team.
So we obviously need our vision, our mission, our values, but actually they're nice words that, as you say, we can either agree or disagree, but we'll agree. So actually it's more about the operating rhythms, how we communicate, how we make decisions, what we say, what we do in different scenarios. One thing that we come into the question quite a lot is creating systematizations around our business too early on can sometimes create a rigidity that means that we can't be agile as scale-ups or as startups. Is there a similar scenario when it comes to scaling our culture, or actually do we need this rigidity around culture that then actually enables us to have more flexibility around other operations?
Yeah, very good question. So when the culture is a bit weak, I think this is where you tend to start seeing lots of processes, because people don't know how to make decisions and what is the right way to do things. You need to actually give them a process to follow. And if there's no process, they're going to be a bit lost, and they can't rely on like values to this is the way we do things. Like, for example, you have even in policies, and like in policies, I mean, at government level, there's two types of laws. Like, you have very like restrictive rules. You can't do this. You can't smoke inside. This is quite clear. And you have stuff that is more principles based. For example, in the financial sector, you need to treat your customers fairly. So what does this mean? You need to make the right decisions in order to not treat your customers unfairly. And this is more subject to debate, but this is the principle guiding what you end up doing, right? If you put very strict rules, there's always going to be gaps. And as soon as there's a gap, people are going to find the gap to use to actually do what they wanted to do. Right. But if you refer them back to those values, it's way clearer, right? If your value is something like make sure you act for the benefits of the company, if there's no policy on whether you should get refunded for a £1,000 meal outside because there's no policy, you still would say, okay, actually, was this for the benefits of the company? You can make the decision of, yeah, maybe if I signed the contract for £100,000, that was worth it. Maybe if I could have done the same thing going to McDonald's, I should have done that. And this is how you can make the decision on whether I can do this or should do this or shouldn't, more based on the principle behind the rule rather than the needing actual rules. Nice. So okay. I think actually, just to end the circle on this, I think if you base decisions on if you have a strong culture and you can base decisions on values shared rather than like hard set rules, you are actually more flexible and you can grow in a more flexible way because people know what decisions to make and what is right and what is wrong. That's super valuable. And also from a founder's perspective, I almost feel less worried or stressed about creating the perfect rules because you don't need to consider for every eventuality if you've got that essence in place. I played a game the other day, I can't remember what game it was, but at the end of the rules, it basically said, if it feels like cheating, then it probably is. And I was like, I love that. You've told me the rules and then you've just told me the general sentiment about how to play the rules. And I guess this is the business equivalent right here. Yeah, there's a great book about this, by the way. It's Flix's founder, and it's called No Rule. Basically, he came in, he started removing rules. Like, it's a long story, but basically they had to fire people because they were losing money. They fired the people who were not performing, like maybe half of them, and they noticed that they started performing better, even with less headcount, because they kept what they say is like a higher talent density. And he said that what we started doing is, because these people are super engaged and high performers, we started removing rules to enable them to make the right decisions because the culture was so strong. And it's worked better for them. So they removed old rules. And the only rule was you should do what's best for the company. Fascinating. Okay. So let's get into scaling then. So we've defined what our culture is. We've created the principles, vision, the mission, the values around it. We've set up some more specific methods of communication and styles and
I know we've just talked about removing rules, but like codes of conduct in terms of how we communicate if we call or email or whatnot. Let's say we're going on this journey that you've been with Credit Spring, going from 4 people to 65. What are the main challenges and stresses that happens on culture through that scaling journey? Any core inflection points or pitfalls?
Yeah, definitely. I think the hard bit was when we were forced to go when COVID hit, and from the day to the next, we lost the ability to be all in an office. And the office is a great environment to show what culture means. So when you're a new joiner, you just join, you tend to come in and observe what's going on around you, right? And you see what behaviors are okay, what behaviors are not okay. You get all of that feedback from being in the office around the people who are already in the company. When all of a sudden we found ourselves in remote universe without having been prepared for it and having to hire people remotely, we had so many difficulties because we switched too fast from being office first and having this culture just infused in the office vibe to having to find a way to also explain or give a feeling of what the culture is to our new joiners. And it was especially hard for junior team members, because imagine this is your first job. You have never been in an office. You don't know what's normal from what's not normal. You just don't know. Even what's normal situation in an office or like at work is. You add to that you're starting this in a new company that you have no clue how the company works.
Yeah.
It was really hard. So we needed to spend extra time making sure that people understood this. What I found worked very well is we identified culture champions. So these are the people who, if you ask around you, if you ask about every company has stories about like how they were built, how the team grew, etc. And you have these stories. Oh, do you remember the day when X did this? And these stories, the main characters in them are culture heroes, basically. They are the people who embed your culture the most in most cases. And we identified one of them who is brilliant. And we had her run culture onboarding sessions for all the new joiners.
Were they badged as that cultural onboarding, or was it just onboarding?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, okay.
No, we had a culture onboarding session where she would run fun exercises to give people who just joined an idea on what culture looks like within Credit Spring. And she was actually amazing at this. And we had so much great feedback on it because people were like, oh, I understand now.
Do you have an example of a sort of, if anybody's thinking, that's it, I've got my culture champions, what sort of exercises to deliver, what sort of insight?
You know what? I think I would give you an example of what she did, but I don't want to influence what people would come up with.
Sure.
So I think go to these people and tell them, how would you explain what the culture at our company is? And I'm sure they'll find something great to say, and just give them the space to do that. She had like little quizzes on what culture meant for us, what were our values and things like that, but also how to implement them in the work context.
No.
But what they were exactly, I think is going to vary from a company to another.
Makes sense. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Other than that, I would say the other inflection point is when you start having what I don't like this term, but middle managers, is when you start at the beginning of a startup, you have this very weird pyramid where you have maybe a few people at the top, potentially co-founders, maybe 1 or 2 senior hires from early days, and then you probably have lots of junior people. And at some point, the number of more junior people becomes too big for them to be managed directly by the most senior ones. So you add an extra layer of management, and you need to be extra careful at that step because these people become super central. They are the central cog in making sure that your culture is uniform across the company, but also that it fits the goals and strategy of the company. Yeah. And they need to, for me, managers are super key in sharing culture, embodying that culture, and making sure that, yes, there might be some like small cultural differences from a team to another team, maybe subcultures, but there's overall there's a coherent system within.
So actually, I guess the second inflection point you mentioned is something that every company will face when they go from this kind of 4 to 64. I'll say 4 to 64, it sounds nicer. 4 to 65, 4 to 64. But there's also this point where the kind of operating rhythms behind a business do actually need to change at some point. And we've seen this a lot within businesses where sometimes the more junior team that are used to that real startup mentality, we can all fit around the pizza, we can all live within the chaos, and we can make decisions and make mistakes and do whatever else. When that middle management comes in, they're obviously there to create a bit of consistency and a bit of control, and obviously those staff end up having more defined roles, which by the very nature of an individual's day-to-day, their experience of the culture will become different. They're reporting to different people, they do different stuff, their decision making is different. Did you come into contact with any conflicts where the middle management layer started to change the culture, and whether or not the cultural shift that was happening was a necessity to enhance the business, or actually, basically, how do you know if the changing from middle management is a necessity, or actually if it's a bad direction for the culture?
I think this is the point where you need to start surveying your people. And you also need to make sure that this culture needs to start like put in writing, basically. I think it's actually about at that time when we had a set of values that were set up by the founders before they actually started the company. And then we had too many values. I think we had something like 15. No one knew where to find them. No one knew what they were. We had a set culture, like we felt like we were part of something, we were doing in some type of way. And that's the point where we were like, okay, I think it's now time to go back and refresh this. And we did a great workshop where we basically split the teams, not by the team they work in on the day-to-day, a bit randomly, into smaller groups. And we asked everyone to put into words what they thought the values of the company were. And then we came back to the same Zoom call, and we put our ideas in common. And we actually found that the themes were very common across. So people would tell them, use different words to express them, but the themes were still very much consistent. So we put them all together, then we voted on the best way to express them, the way that was the least confusing, at least that clearly told you what we were about. And we adopted them as our new values. And because they were coming bottom up and not they were probably inherently created by the founding team, but they were felt and agreed upon by everyone. We put them in writing. Then we also tweaked our interview processes to test for, basically, instead of testing for, we had a part where that was more like linked to what the job was. So we had 3 steps of interviews. First step was like just a filter. Second one was very much values oriented. So we would test for values first before we start digging into, can this person do the job that they are technically hired to do? We tested for that. And we implemented them in the performance reviews. So we did performance reviews every 6 months, and you would be scored. You would have like personal goals, but you would also be rated on other, like how you would fit into our company values. And so this way, you don't just forget about them. Also we ran sprints, and at the end of every sprint, we would do like a retro where we would think about, as a team, we would think about how the last couple of weeks went and what went well, what didn't go well. And we would also do that based on values. So we would say, okay, we did well on this value, and this is an example of how we did well. We didn't do great at this value. and this is when it happened. And so this way, you repeat them every 2 weeks.
Sure, yeah.
You repeat them every 2 weeks. Everyone who gets hired without knowing gets tested on those values, and you get assessed on them every 6 months. So they're not completely lost or they're not just written somewhere and then never applied or never used. So it makes them way easier to keep in mind, and you can then base your decision making on those, because this is how things are done here.
So that really is an intensive, very value indexed setup. You've obviously worked with businesses from corporate to Credit Spring to everything else in between. How much of an impact does that have? And I accept that having a strong culture and being values led is valuable, but that feels almost quite extreme in terms of how focused the values are. Does the impact continue to have a scaling impact, or actually how much is too much?
You know what? I did my homework before this meeting, and I found a number. There's a study that shows that was run across 600 companies over a long period of time. And it showed that companies who were values led and had a strong culture had 4 times more revenues, which is insane. Yeah.
Who's created that study? I am ever a skeptic of studies like that.
I'll send you the link.
There's a link in the show notes as well.
Sounds good. And there's also something like 40% of people who resign from their jobs resign because they don't feel part of the culture. They don't feel like they're fit in their company's culture. So not being culture driven has a cost, not only in terms of revenues, but also in terms of retention. And we all know how much it costs to replace people, good people, when they leave.
So revenues are higher. If we're assuming that higher turnover of staff is an increased costs are lower, revenues higher. Listen to Sarah, she knows what she's talking about. So that when you come with facts to back up what you're saying, that's bulletproof. So Sarah, this is super interesting. So we create our cultures, we create our ops, we perhaps re-engineer them. This process you went through, what size was Credit Spring when you did the re-evaluation of the values?
I think we were somewhere between 20 and 30.
Oh, okay, cool. So quite early on, really, in terms of the journey. And would you anticipate that would need to be done again at some point, or actually is the culture or the values created at 2030 enough to scale?
No, probably. I think there's a point where you need to rethink it. It doesn't mean that you need to let go of there's this thing, because no culture is perfect, right? And the way I think about it, I don't know who made this parallel, which I found quite good, is when you're running a startup, you're basically driving a car that is on fire. You need to stop the fire and also keep on driving the car. So this means, if you apply this to culture, it means that you probably have some parts of your culture that you're not super happy with, right? Like potentially people argue a lot, which is great on one side, but maybe they don't know how to argue, and it leads to frustrations or some type of anger. And so you probably want to work on these sides of culture, or maybe they don't disagree at all, which is also a problem. It means that you don't get conflicting ideas and you don't get to the best idea. You probably have some fires that you need to fix, but you also need to keep on driving the car, because you need to take this culture with you as you grow. And when you're driving the car, you're going to hit bumps in the road and you're going to need to fix them. It might make some fire seem more urgent to fix, right? If X and Y event happens. But for sure, what a company is when you're 4, 5, 6 people, and what it is when you're just, I think, when you go from 10 to 30, when you go from less than 10 to 10, it's a big change. Then from 10 to 30 is another inflection point. And then potentially it happens again around 100. So regularly revisit those, try and assess if this is still the culture that the company has now. If not, did it go to a way you were happy with, not happy with? How can you put it back on track, or reinforce these new types of characters that you're seeing that you are happy with?
Nice. I love that. I'm going to round up in the next 5 minutes. So if anybody in the audience has any questions, now's your time to either drop them in the chat or in the Q&A. We also have the fantastic Ella and Tiago that are in the background to answer any other questions or support as you need. But Sarah, so you've obviously done a lot with this. What would you say? I love your car on fire analogy, and I know it certainly feels like that sometimes, which means that sometimes when we're putting out all of the flames, our ability to do big exercises and sessions to evaluate and whatever else may be limited. What would you say are the smallest things that have had the biggest impact on protecting culture as you scale?
I would say calling out unacceptable behavior, or not, calling out unacceptable behavior, and also reinforcing good behavior. And this is where your managers are super key, because they're going to see them way more than you do. And they are in touch with the team. They have one-on-ones with the team. They have team meetings where they can say, this is the type of behavior we want to keep on seeing. This is the type of behavior that is simply not acceptable here. And this doesn't take any extra time.
It doesn't take time, but it does take actually the management culture, this kind of ability to have conflict and then get back on board with team decision, which I know actually in the early days of startup, it's hard to actually have that, particularly if you feel like some of your team are working for the mission and the vision, and actually sometimes you let things slip a little bit. So that really is logical hearing that come from you, but I'm sure there's many people listening that are like, yep, I probably need to do that more. What would you say are the non-negotiables if you were to start this journey again, which I know you are, but when you start this journey again, what would you say are the non-negotiables in terms of creating culture and the tenets that you put in?
I think hiring is so key, especially in the early days. Like being able to, like you were saying, yes, it's hard to have this conversation sometimes when you are already like onboarding someone, like when someone is already in the company, but maybe have this conversation before you bring them in, right? Especially the first hires. You need to really make sure that this is a person I can have open conversations with, and I can give back feedback to, and they are going to give me feedback too. And it doesn't mean that we're not friends anymore, or we hate each other, or we can't talk. I think I'm super pro constructive criticism and constructive debates, I would say. And yeah, like this is so key. Even as like when I start even working with startups as an advisor, I go through like something like an interview. I would actually test the people I'm interviewing with, because it's a two-way street. Like it's not just you hiring someone, you're also are going to work with someone.
Sure.
I try and launch some little like feedback that I know is going to be a bit harsh, and I wait to see how are they going to take it. Are they annoyed? If they don't hire me, or they don't want to work with me because I gave them feedback, then I'm happy with it, because I don't want to work with them either. And if they take it on, then we're good.
I love that. We definitely run on that principle internally in terms of at the end of our recruitment process, we actually have a meet the team and then actually some working sessions as well. The absolute principle of that is for us to almost see behind the recruitment mask when people come on and they're being their best selves. But most importantly is also for that person to let them know what they're getting themselves into, like actually feel what it's like and understand what it would be like to communicate. We've got a question from Isabel here. So some companies just don't document anything. Obviously, we spoke about that briefly. It's not only that they aren't organized, it's just that they don't want to be. Usually they say it's because they're agile or innovative, or that the structure is too horizontal. How would you approach that, and what's its impact on culture? Great question.
Yeah. Isabel, I might ask you a question. If you can type the answer to it, that would be great. When you have faced this, do you feel like people have made the right decisions in this context, or that decision-making frameworks were consistent across the company?
Interesting. I'm not sure if Isabel is, we'll see if she responds. I feel like you've matched a tricky question with a tricky question there, Sarah. Just in case, no, not always, we've got from Isabel.
Yeah, so the comment is, my feedback would be, you can't be agile and run fast if you don't know what you're doing. It basically means that people just take random decisions that are not going towards the company goals or the company strategy and values, because they're at the end of the day, they're the same thing. Then they are moving fast, but they are not going to where you want to be going. And it's like there's a difference between speed and velocity. It's also one of my favorite sentences. Speed is just a function of how fast you are going. Velocity is speed plus direction. So let's say you want to go north and you are going super fast, but going south. You're getting further from your goal. And this is the issue with not documenting things like values, not documenting the way we do things, goals and strategy, because it just means that if people don't know where they're going, they're going to make random decisions and they're not going to move towards their goal. So sometimes it's good to slow down, write stuff down, and it doesn't need to be a massive time suck. And then everyone is aligned and everyone knows where they're going.
Insight drop right there, Sarah. That is, speed versus velocity. Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who come to our webinars regularly, watch out for me dropping that sentence, that quote, like it's my own. You can call me out on it. I will. That's really fascinating, Sarah. Really makes a lot of sense. What would you say have been the best resources, ways of finding information, like staying on the top of your game as you've been on your journey to maintain focus and ability while scaling the business?
Writing, actually.
Interesting.
I write a lot. Dropping quotes, but I think if you don't write, you don't know how good your thought is if you didn't put it in writing. And so this is key. Block time to do that. I have a very crazy calendar where I have like a number of colors, blocking time slots to do this type of thinking, and make sure that you're going where you want to be going. And if you're not, you can redress the situation.
Just diving into that, do you have a particular format that you write in? Do you sit down with an intention to write something, or do you just allow the writing to happen?
This is my notes for today.
Nice.
Yeah, otherwise I think I tried every tool out there. I use Notion. I've been playing with Waybook over the last few months, which is great. And I also just put stuff in writing, like on paper. Post-its, I have plenty of post-its if I don't have to write on. I just write. I
asked selfishly because actually a few months ago, I've started writing again. And I think I've got so stuck in technical tools. I've actually just started writing 3 pages every morning just for the sake of writing. And sometimes it's rubbish. Sometimes it's strategic genius. Sometimes it's somewhere in between. But actually, I think just that process of forcing stuff out actually almost seems to keep things moving, which is really fascinating. And I feel like I interrupted you. I felt like you were going to say another thing in terms of any resources or tools that you've used over your journey so far.
Yeah, I guess writing, there's great content out there. I think the difficulty is more how you find it, where you have access to it. So that's an interesting problem to solve, but there is great content out there. And just being in touch with your team, listening to what they have to say, listen to their feedback on what works and what doesn't work is key.
Amazing. I think there's such a lovely sentiment in there where actually there becomes a point when we're scaling businesses that as founders and as senior leaders, we focus so much on finding the problem solution fit, the product market fit, optimizing what we do and how we do it. And there becomes a point where a lot of our focus of our senior leaders actually then has to turn inwards. And when our businesses become a size and a scale where it's an organization, we almost can then apply that same thinking of the customers are now the team, and actually we exist in order to make our team as effective as possible. And I love your point there about listening to your team and actually finding the product market fit of how the operation works and the team works and what the market needs and what you do. Sarah, it's been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. Personally, I've taken away so much. This concept of culture being important, you've loaded us with the stats. We're not going to question you. You make 4 times the amount of money. You save loads of money. 40% of people are not going to leave you anymore if you have your good culture in there. The underpinnings of culture are, of course, your vision, your mission, but also your values. I love your point about making sure that your values are actionable in terms of how we communicate, how we operate, how we work. The specific identification of using culture champions as we scale and encouraging our team and our cultural champions to re-inject that culture back into our team. And as Sarah said, don't copy somebody else's examples, but make sure that your narrative and your exercises work for your culture and your champions. This concept of refreshing your culture, making sure we're taking it seriously from day one, but then also doing that as it expands to maybe 10 and 30 and 100, and I guess your inflection points will change. And also, as you said, Sarah, if we're going through differences or we're changing the way we're operating or working, like we all did within COVID, then that's a time to really take care of our culture, make sure we have that accountability, calling out behavior that doesn't quite work, instilling it into our hiring process. And the quote that has blown my mind is making sure that we understand the difference between speed and velocity, keep things documented to make sure that we can pick up speed, but most importantly, velocity. That's a lot. We've covered it. We've covered the ground.
We did.
Sarah, thank you so much for helping answer this question. How do we protect and manage culture within our scaling business? I know you are cooking up some amazing and exciting things. How can people follow along and see what's coming next from you?
Yeah, on LinkedIn, you can find me with just Googling my name. I'm quite lucky that there's not so many of us called that, and same on Twitter.
Amazing. We'll drop all of the relevant links in the show notes. Once again, thank you all very much for coming and the amazing questions. Sarah, thank you so much for your time. Wishing you all an amazing evening, and I look forward to seeing you at the next Smooth Scaling webinar. It's in 2 weeks, and we're looking at how we can actually focus on continuing to optimize our product market fit whilst we're scaling our team, working in different changing environments with the amazing Paul Archer from Dual Tech. So we'll get all of that in your inbox for you to join us. But for now, thank you so much for coming. Sarah, have an amazing evening, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye now.